Okay, let's jump right in. Today, in What's New in 22Q, we're talking about something every parent and caregiver thinks about: vaccinations.
Mm,
You follow the schedule, you get the shots, you get the card stamp, and you assume your child is protected. But what if that protection doesn't last?
that's the big question, isn't it?
Hmm.
And for individuals with 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, it's not just a hypothetical. The rules can be a little different.
And that uncertainty is exactly what we want to tackle today. We're going to dive into some brand new research that gives us some really clear answers on long-term immunity.
Yeah, our mission here is to cut through that confusion and give you some real clarity on where protection is strong and, maybe more importantly, where it might be fading a bit too soon.
We're pulling all of this from a fantastic new article. It's by Layla Farpour and her colleagues.
Right.
The title is Vaccine Immunity in Patients with 22q11.2 Microdeletion Syndrome. It was just published this year, 2025, in the journal Pediatric Allergy and Immunology.
And before we get into the numbers, it's probably good to just quickly set the stage on why this is even a topic for 22q.
Good idea.
So many individuals with the syndrome have something called thymus hypoplasia. The thymus gland is, think of it like a boot camp for your T cells.
Okay, the body's defense force.
Exactly. And those T cells are critical for what we call adaptive immunity. That's the long-term memory system that vaccines rely on. So if the boot camp is a bit underdeveloped, that memory might not be as strong or last as long.
Which is why just looking at the vaccination card isn't enough. We need to check the actual defense level.
Precisely. And that's what this study did. It was an observational study in Geneva. They followed 41 patients aged 1 to 25, and they checked their actual antibody levels, their seroprotection.
And I think we should start with the good news because there is some really reassuring data in here.
Yes, absolutely. Let's start there. The overall immunological picture for most patients was actually quite good.
What did that look like?
Well, over 80% had normal levels of their main immune cells, T cells and B cells. And almost everyone, 98%, had normal IgG levels.
So the fundamental machinery, the factory that makes the antibodies, is working well for most people.
That's a great way to put it. The capacity is there, and this shows up in some of the vaccine results, too.
Okay, like what?
For tetanus, every single patient in the study was still fully protected, 100%.
Wow, that's fantastic. That's a huge relief.
It really is. It shows that for some things, the standard schedule works perfectly, and that protection really sticks around.
And what about newer vaccines?
Also very good news. For SARS-CoV-2, 98% of patients were seroprotected. So again, really high sustained protection.
Okay, so that's the encouraging baseline. Tetanus and COVID-19 look great. But this is where the study gets really critical for families.
Right, because the central finding, and you can't really avoid it, is that for several other key vaccines, protection is fading too early. The researchers call it premature waning.
Premature waning, that's the key phrase for today.
It is. It means the vaccine works at first, but the body's memory just fades too quickly, and the gaps they found weren't small.
Let's start with the one the authors seemed most concerned about: pneumococcus.
Yes. Pneumococcal infections can be really serious: pneumonia, meningitis, and the findings here were, well, they were alarming.
How so?
Over half, 54% of the patients were not protected.
Wait, more than half?
More than half. And what's really critical is that 70% of those unprotected patients had received the full recommended series of shots as babies.
So parents did everything right, followed the schedule, and for more than half of them, the protection just wasn't there anymore.
Exactly. And when you look at the timing, the data showed protection against pneumococcus dropped off really quite quickly, often within the first 5 years after vaccination.
5 years. So a child gets their shots as a toddler, and by the time they're starting primary school, they could be totally unprotected.
Yes. That's a huge window of risk, right when they're starting to be around a lot more kids. It just shows the standard schedule isn't enough for long-term defense in this group.
Okay, that's a massive takeaway. Let's move to hepatitis B. What did this study find there?
Another area with major gaps. Almost half, 49% of patients had insufficient protection.
And was it the same story? That even the fully vaccinated people were losing protection?
It was. Among the patients who had completed the full series, 38%, so more than a third, were still unprotected.
So again, you can't just trust the vaccine card. It might say complete, but the immune system says unprotected.
That's the bottom line. For hepatitis B, the decline was a bit more gradual, but there was a really notable drop-off after about 10 years.
10 years. So that risk window opens up right around the teenage years and early adulthood.
Exactly, which makes ongoing checks for young adults just non-negotiable.
Okay, now what about the live vaccines? Let's talk about measles.
Measles is always a huge concern because it's so contagious. Here they found that 1/3 of fully vaccinated patients were not protected.
A third? And what was the timeline for that waning?
The drop was pretty sharp after about 12 years post-vaccination.
12 years. So again, protection is fading right as a child is becoming an adolescent, heading into high school, college environments with a lot of people.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That's a really vulnerable time for that defense to be fading.
And the last big one, varicella or chickenpox.
For varicella, more than a quarter, 27%, were not protected. But the really critical point here for caregivers is how they figured that out.
Go on.
The study showed that relying only on a patient's history, whether a parent remembers them having chickenpox or if the card says they got the 2 shots, that history was completely unreliable.
So you can't just say, oh, he had it when he was 5.
You can't. The history just didn't match up with the actual antibody levels in the blood.
The running theme here seems to be you have to test. You can't guess.
You absolutely have to test. The physical evidence from the antibody test is what matters, not just the paper trail.
It's interesting because the study also noted that most of the patients, about 78%, had a history of things like frequent ear infections or bronchitis in early childhood.
Yes, and those usually resolve by about age 9 or 10.
So what does that tell us?
It suggests that, while the immune system often matures and gets better at fighting off those common everyday infections, that underlying challenge of maintaining long-term vaccine memory, that persists.
So the body gets better at fighting a cold, but it's still forgetting the lessons from the vaccine.
That's a perfect summary. It's why we need to keep checking, even when the child seems perfectly healthy.
Okay, so this brings us to the most important part. What do we do? What's the actionable advice for families listening right now?
The big message is we need to shift from a passive, calendar-based approach to a proactive, evidence-based one.
So if I'm a listener, what's my new checklist to take to my doctor? What's item 1?
Item 1, serology first. You need to ask for a regular assessment of antibody levels for 4 specific diseases: measles, hepatitis B, varicella, and pneumococcus.
A simple blood test.
The simple blood test. And then revaccination should be based on those results, not just because a certain amount of time has passed.
And are there specific ages or milestones when we should be checking?
Yes, based on the data, for measles, it's really vital to check during adolescence. We saw that drop after 12 years, so if your child is 13, 14, now is the time to ask for that test.
Okay. And for varicella, since the history is so unreliable?
For varicella, they suggest checking regularly, maybe every 3 to 5 years. You just can't assume they're covered.
Got it. Now, what about just making sure the original vaccine series gets finished? The study mentioned some issues there.
Yes, and that brings us to checklist item 2. Focus on completing the series. For hepatitis B especially, the study found a lot of young adults were unprotected simply because they never finished the initial shots.
So that's a straightforward fix.
A very straightforward fix. Complete the series and then check the antibody level to make sure it worked.
And for pneumococcus, with that really rapid 5-year decline, what's the recommendation?
This is item 3, and it's a big one. Demand the additional pneumococcal dose. The study strongly supports what some specialized guidelines already recommend.
An extra shot.
An extra booster dose should probably be given to all patients with 22q because the standard childhood schedule just isn't holding up.
That is incredibly clear guidance. What about diphtheria? Tetanus was 100%, but diphtheria comes in the same shot.
Diphtheria protection was generally good, but the analysis did show it starts to decrease after 10 years. So it's not a premature failure, but it's a strong reminder to be really strict with those 10-year boosters. Don't let it slide to year 11 or 12.
Okay, and one last one. Hepatitis A. Not everyone gets it, but what did they find?
For the small group that was fully vaccinated against Hep A, the results were perfect. 100% protection.
So if your local guidelines recommend it because your child's considered immunocompromised, you should do it with confidence.
Absolutely. It shows the body can respond really well when the series is completed.
It is so important to share these findings because this kind of awareness leads directly to better care. This deep dive is brought to you by 22q11 Europe, the European Association supporting families living with 22q11 deletion syndrome, and they're dedicated to making sure you have access to this exact kind of vital research.
And really, the message here shouldn't be one of panic. It should be one of empowerment.
I agree.
This research gives us a very specific roadmap. We know exactly which vaccines to watch: measles, pneumococcus, Hep B, varicella, and we know when to watch them. That knowledge is everything.
So here's our final thought for you to take away today. For your family member with 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, that vaccination card is only half the story. The only way to be sure about long-term safety is to check the antibody levels.
Stop relying on the date of the shot. Start relying on the evidence of the test.
Take that list of 4 vaccines to your doctor and just start the conversation about running serology. That one proactive step could be key to decades of health and protection.
We really encourage you to open that conversation with your physician or immunologist this week.
Thank you for listening to What's New in 22q, produced by Dr. Stefan Elias for 22q11 Europe. Take care and talk to you soon.